The boy in the grey linen shirt had been standing at the edge of the playground for 11 minutes without moving. Nobody noticed him, except the girl on the swings. He wasn't playing, he wasn't crying, he was just watching her, like she was a fire he was scared to touch. Finally, he walked up, hands shaking so badly he had to shove them in his pockets. "Can I rent your mom for today?" The girl stopped swinging. The chains creaked in the silence. "I have $40, he said, pulling out a crumpled wad of bills. "It's all I have. My dad is really sad, and I don't know how to fix him. I saw on TV, you can rent things, so I thought, maybe you could rent me a mom. Just for today." Somewhere behind them, a woman in a faded blue sundress was folding a picnic blanket, completely unaware that her life was about to change. The girl looked at the money, then at his face, and said the 4 words that would change 3 lives before sunset. "You don't have to. Stay with this one, because it does not go where you think it goes. And if you're the kind of person who believes love finds people in the strangest ways, comment below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story leads. And give this video a like if a 6-year-old already broke your heart in the first 30 seconds. Her name was Lily Whitfield, 7 years old, missing her left front tooth, and she had a way of looking at people that made grown adults feel like they'd been caught in a lie. The boy's name was Ethan Kang, and though neither child knew it yet, his family's name alone was enough to make grown men in South Florida straighten their ties and lower their voices. Ethan had been quiet for 2 years, not sick quiet, not shy quiet, the kind of quiet that worried teachers and made housekeepers whisper to each other in the hallway. Ever since his mother died, he had stopped asking for things. He stopped drawing pictures of superheroes. He stopped begging to stay up late, watching the boats come into the marina. The only thing he asked for anymore was silence, and his father, in his own broken way, had learned to give it to him. So when Ethan told his father's driver that morning that he wanted to be dropped at the park near the marina instead of school, the driver, a soft-spoken man named Raphael, who had known Ethan since he was in diapers, should have said no. He didn't. Because Ethan hadn't asked for anything real in 2 years, and Raphael wasn't about to be the one who told him no the first time he did. What Raphael didn't know was that Ethan had spent the last 3 weeks studying his father the way a detective studies a case file. He noticed the way his father stood too long at his mother's photograph in the hallway of their Coral Gables house before turning off the lights. He noticed the untouched dinners, still warm, still wrapped in foil by the housekeeper the next morning. He noticed that his father laughed only when cameras were on him, at shareholder events, at galas overlooking the water, and that the laugh never once reached his eyes. Ethan didn't have the words for grief. He didn't have the words for loneliness either. But he had a plan, built entirely on the logic of a child who believes the world can be fixed if you just find the right person to ask. He'd chosen Lily because 3 days earlier, at the same park, he had watched her fix a broken bird's wing with a popsicle stick and a hair tie, humming the whole time like it was the most natural thing in the world. If she could fix a bird, he reasoned, her mother could probably fix anything. "I don't want your money," Lily said again, more firmly this time, tucking her hands into the sleeves of her cardigan despite the Florida heat, the way kids do when they need something to hold on to. "But I'll ask her. She's really nice. She might say yes for free." Lily, the woman in the blue sundress, had crossed the playground without either child noticing, and now she stood with the picnic bag over her shoulder, staring down at her daughter with the particular exhaustion of a mother who has had exactly 1 good morning off in 3 months and can already feel it slipping away. "What are you doing?" "Mom, this is Ethan. His dad is sad. He wants to rent you." Grace Whitfield had heard a lot of strange things come out of her daughter's mouth. Lily had once informed a bank teller that God lived in the vending machine because that's where the snacks appeared from. She had told her kindergarten teacher that manatees were just dogs who forgot how to walk. But this was a new kind of strange, and Grace felt her whole body go still in the particular way it did whenever life was about to ask something of her she wasn't ready to give. She looked at the boy. Something about him, the stiffness in his shoulders, the too careful way he held himself, like a child trying to be smaller than he was, made her chest tighten before she even understood why. "Sweetheart," she said gently, crouching down to Ethan's level. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "I have $40, Ethan said again, quieter now, like he already sensed he was losing. "I know it's not enough. I can get more. I have savings at home. My Halmoni gave it to me for my birthday. I can bring all of it. You don't need to bring anything." Grace's voice cracked slightly on the word anything, and she hated that it did. Hated that a stranger's child could find the one soft place in her so easily. "Where's your dad, honey?" Ethan pointed across the park, to the black Range Rover, idling at the curb, where a man in a linen suit stood with his phone pressed to his ear, pacing 3 steps forward and 3 steps back, like a man trapped inside an invisible cage. Grace recognized the car before she recognized the man. Everyone in Miami who read a newspaper recognized that car and the name stitched discreetly into the leather seats. And when the man finally lowered the phone and turned toward the playground, scanning for his son with the controlled panic of a father who had looked away for 1 minute too long, Grace Whitfield felt the ground shift beneath her feet, because she knew exactly who he was. Michael Kang, founder and CEO of Kang Dynamics, the logistics and shipping conglomerate whose cranes lined half the Port of Miami skyline. His face had been on the news 18 months ago, standing behind a podium under the South Florida sun, expressing his condolences for an accident at one of his company's distribution warehouses out near Hialeah. The warehouse where her husband, David, had died. She hadn't told Lily the full truth about her father's death. She'd said there was an accident. She'd said Daddy was a hero who was helping people when it happened. She had never said the name Kang Dynamics out loud in front of her daughter. Not once, because she wasn't sure her voice would survive it. And now his son was standing 3 feet away, offering her 40 crumpled dollars to fix his father's broken heart. "Ethan!" Michael's voice cut across the playground, relief and fear tangled together in a single word, and he was moving fast now, weaving between benches, his jacket flapping open in the humid breeze. When he reached them, he dropped to one knee in front of his son and gripped his shoulders like he needed to confirm he was solid, real, still there. "You cannot just leave like that. Do you understand? You cannot just disappear on me." "I didn't disappear," Ethan said. "I was fixing you." Michael blinked. "Fixing me? Mrs. Whitfield's mom is nice," Lily offered helpfully, pointing at her own mother. "He wants to rent her." There was a silence then, the kind that stretches so long it starts to feel like its own separate event, and Michael Kang, a man who had negotiated $100 million shipping contracts without blinking, found himself utterly speechless in front of a public swing set with the bay glittering behind him. He looked at his son's face, flushed with embarrassment, and something rawer underneath it, something that looked dangerously close to hope. And Michael understood, with the sudden clarity of a man watching his own mistakes catch up to him, exactly what his silence and his empty dinners and his locked office door had done to this boy. Then he looked up, and his eyes met Grace's, and something passed between two strangers who were not, in fact, strangers at all, though only one of them knew it yet. "I'm so sorry," Michael said, standing, brushing invisible sand from his knees, retreating into the practiced calm of a man used to smoothing over disasters. "My son has an active imagination. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." "It's fine," Grace said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended, colder, and she saw something flicker across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of recognition, because men like Michael Kang were not used to being spoken to like that, especially not by women in second-hand sundresses at public parks. "Do you two know each other?" Ethan asked, looking between them with the sharp, unfiltered curiosity of a child who notices everything adults try to hide. "No," Grace said quickly. "No," Michael agreed. though something in his throat caught on the word. But Ethan wasn't finished. He turned back to Grace, his small hands still clutched around the $40, and his voice dropped into something quieter, something that sounded less like a 6-year-old and more like a boy who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his room at night, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the air conditioning hum. "Please," he said, "just for one day." He hasn't laughed since Mom died. Not a real laugh. I know the difference. "Please, just come to dinner, that's all. Just dinner." And here is where the story could have ended, with a polite refusal, a car door closing, two families returning to their separate orbits, never to intersect again. That would have been the easy version. That would have been the easy version, where nobody's wounds got reopened, where nobody's secrets came due. But Grace Whitfield looked down at Lily, who was watching her with those wide, hopeful eyes, the same eyes she used to fix broken birds. And Grace thought about the water bill sitting unpaid on her kitchen counter in her small apartment off Calle Ocho, and the shift she'd lost last week when the diner cut hours, and the growing ache of raising a daughter alone in a world that kept closing doors before you even reached them. And underneath all of that, quieter, sharper, she thought about the settlement papers from Kang Dynamics' insurance company that she'd never signed, sitting in a drawer for 18 months, because signing them felt like agreeing that David's life had a price tag, and the price tag they'd offered had felt like an insult. She thought, maybe this is how I finally get answers. "One dinner," she heard herself say, "that's all." Ethan's whole face changed. It was like watching a light switch on behind a boy's eyes for the first time in 2 years, and even Michael, standing there in his linen suit, with his phone forgotten in his pocket, felt something crack open in his chest at the sight of it. Something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. "Grace Whitfield," she said, extending a hand toward Michael, testing him, waiting to see if the name meant anything to him at all. It didn't. Not yet. And that, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know about how far removed a man like Michael Kang was from the consequences of his own company. "Michael Kang," he said, shaking her hand, his grip warm and steady, and entirely unaware that he was shaking the hand of a widow his negligence had made. "Thank you, truly. You have no idea what this means." "I think I might," Grace said quietly, and turned to gather her daughter's things before he could ask what she meant. The house on the private drive off Old Cutler Road was the kind of place Grace had only ever seen in magazines at the dentist's office. Coral stone walls, a black iron gate, a driveway longer than her entire street, banyan trees arching overhead like something out of a dream she wasn't supposed to be standing in. Lily pressed her face to the car window the whole ride up, narrating everything she saw like a nature documentary host. And Grace gripped the wheel of her 10-year-old sedan and told herself over and over that she was doing this for the money. $500 for one evening, Michael had insisted, more than she made in 2 weeks at the diner, and she had let him believe that was the only reason she'd said yes. It wasn't the only reason. It wasn't even the main reason, but it was easier to let him think it was. Dinner started stiffly. Ethan sat rigid in his chair, glancing between his father and Grace, like a boy watching a science experiment he wasn't sure would work, and Michael made careful, polished small talk that felt rehearsed even to Grace's untrained ear. The kind of conversation a man has when he's spent so long being interviewed that he's forgotten how to simply talk. An older woman, Ethan's grandmother, watched quietly from the head of the table, saying little, missing nothing. It was Lily who broke it. "Somewhere between the appetizer and the second course," she announced, completely unprompted, that the housekeeper's japchae tasted like a hug, and Ethan laughed, a real laugh, sudden and surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. And Michael's chopsticks froze halfway to his mouth, because he hadn't heard that sound from his son in 700 and some odd days, and he had, without realizing it, been counting. "Do that again," Michael said to Lily, quiet, almost desperate. "Do what? Whatever you just did, do it again." And so the evening cracked open, slowly, the way frozen ground cracks open in early spring, not all at once, but in small fissures that widen when you're not looking. Lily told stories. Ethan, emboldened, started telling his own, about the manatees near the seawall and the pelican that stole his sandwich last summer. Grace found herself laughing at something Michael said, a dry, self-deprecating joke about the first time he tried to cook bulgogi and set off every smoke alarm on the second floor, and for one dangerous moment, she forgot entirely why she had agreed to come. Then Michael mentioned, casually, refilling her water glass, that Kang Dynamics had just finalized a new safety initiative for their distribution division, long overdue, honestly, after an incident a couple years back, and Grace's hand tightened around her fork, so hard her knuckles went white. An incident, she repeated. A warehouse accident. Terrible thing. Out near Hialeah. I don't like to talk about it at the table. He said it the way people say things they've trained themselves not to feel anymore. Smooth and distant. A wound long since scarred over from the outside, while something underneath stayed raw. What was his name? Grace asked. The man who died. Michael looked up, surprised by the specificity of the question. I'm sorry? You said a man died. What was his name? There was a pause, and in it, Grace watched something shift behind Michael's eyes. Not guilt, not yet. Just the uncomfortable realization that he genuinely did not know, that the name had been filtered out of his life by lawyers and press releases and quarterly reports long before it ever reached him directly. I'd have to check, he admitted, and something about his honesty made it worse, not better, because it confirmed exactly what she'd always suspected, that David had died as a line item, a number, a regrettable incident, absorbed by insurance and buried under paperwork, while the man who owned the company slept soundly in a house with banyan trees arching over a driveway longer than her street. David Whitfield, Grace said. Her voice didn't shake. She was almost proud of that. That was his name. He worked the night shift for 11 years. He climbed a loading rack that your company was warned about in writing 4 months before it collapsed. He died 40 minutes before an ambulance arrived because your warehouse sat past the county line where the response times run long, and your company decided that was an acceptable risk to build on. The table went silent. Ethan and Lily, who had been giggling over something seconds earlier, both went still, sensing the way children always sense when adult air turns dangerous. Even the grandmother set down her spoon. Michael set down his chopstick slowly. You're his wife. Ethan's spoon had frozen halfway to his mouth. He looked between his father and Grace with the particular stillness of a child, realizing, in real time, that the adults in the room were not who he thought they were, that his careful plan, built on $40 crumpled, had wandered into a story far bigger and far older than anything he could have guessed at on that playground. I'm his widow, Grace said. There's a difference, and your company's lawyers made sure I learned it very quickly. If you feel that shift in your chest right now, that ache, that tightening, comment below and let us know. And if this story has already grabbed hold of you, give it a like, because what happens next is going to test everyone at that table, and nobody in that dining room is walking away unchanged. Michael's face had gone pale, the practiced composure of the boardroom completely stripped away, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. I didn't know, he finally said. I swear to you, I didn't know who you were. If you had, what? Grace's voice cracked now. Finally, after 18 months of holding it steady. Would you have skipped dinner? Would your son have kept begging strangers in parks to fix you? Or would you have finally noticed him yourself? Mom, Lily whispered, tugging at her sleeve, frightened by the sharpness in her mother's voice, and Grace closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe, because whatever this was, whatever anger had been sitting in her chest for 18 months, her daughter did not deserve to watch it detonate over a dinner table on the water. Ethan had gone very quiet again, the old quiet, the 2 years of silence quiet. And it was that, more than anything, that made Grace pause. She watched him shrink into his chair, watched the light she'd seen in him 20 minutes earlier flicker and start to die, and something in her chest twisted painfully, because this boy hadn't done anything. This boy had spent 3 weeks studying his father's grief and building a plan out of $40 and pure hope, and now that hope was collapsing in front of him because of a debt that belonged to the adults, not to him. "I think," Michael said quietly, "we should let the kids finish dessert somewhere else. I'd like to talk. Please, just talk." Grace almost said no. Every instinct in her body told her to grab Lily's hand and walk out that door and never look back, to preserve the 18 months of careful distance she'd built between herself and the name Kang Dynamics. But then she looked at Ethan again, at the way his small hands had curled into fists in his lap, at the way he was staring at the tablecloth like he was trying to disappear into it, and she thought about a boy who had walked up to a stranger with his life savings because he didn't know any other way to save his father. 10 minutes, she said. That's all you get. What Grace didn't know, what nobody at that table knew yet, was that the story she thought she understood was about to fracture into something far more complicated than a widow confronting a careless billionaire. Because in a drawer, in Michael Kang's home office, sealed and unopened for 18 months, sat a file with David Whitfield's name on it. Not an insurance settlement, not a legal document, but something else entirely. Something Michael had signed and forgotten in the numbing weeks after his own wife's death, when grief had made him careless with everything except his son. And somewhere in that same 18 months, a small anonymous envelope had shown up twice at Grace's apartment door off Calle Ocho, containing exactly enough money to cover 2 months' rent, with no return address and no explanation, and Grace had always assumed it was a mistake, or maybe a distant cousin, or maybe just a stranger's kindness she'd never understand. She was about to find out she was wrong about all three. Michael led her onto the back terrace, away from the children's voices drifting faintly from the kitchen, where the housekeeper had ushered Ethan and Lily off with a bowl of mango sorbet and the promise of a movie. The night air was warm and thick with salt, the lights of downtown Miami glittering faintly across the water, and Michael stood at the railing with his back to her for a long moment before he finally spoke. "After my wife died," he said, "I stopped being a person for a while. I know that sounds like an excuse. It isn't meant as one. I signed things I don't remember signing. I approved things without reading them, because reading things required a kind of attention I didn't have anymore. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth." "That doesn't bring David back," Grace said. "No," Michael agreed. "Nothing does." "I know that." He turned to face her, and in the dim terrace light, his expression had lost every trace of the boardroom composure he'd worn at dinner. "But I want to show you something, and I need you to understand that whatever you think of me after you see it, I understand. I won't fight you on it." He led her inside, down a hallway lined with photographs of a woman Grace assumed was his late wife, soft-eyed, laughing in most of them, holding a baby Ethan in one, the bay visible behind them in nearly every frame, and into an office where he unlocked a drawer with a small brass key kept on his own keychain, the kind of key a man keeps close because whatever it opens matters to him more than he lets on. Inside was a folder. David's name was printed on the tab. 18 months ago, Michael said. In the weeks right after the accident, before my wife got sick, before everything in my life fell apart at once, I set up a trust for the families affected by the warehouse incident. Direct payments, no legal strings, no settlement waivers required, nothing that would ask anyone to sign away their right to sue. I wanted it separate from the insurance process entirely, because I didn't trust the insurance process. My lawyers hated it. I did it anyway. Grace's hands had gone cold. 2 envelopes, she said slowly. I got 2 envelopes, no return address. That was supposed to be monthly, Michael said, and his voice cracked slightly now, shame bleeding through the careful control. It was supposed to be monthly, for 2 years. It stopped after my wife's diagnosis, because the person managing it for me, my assistant at the time, quit to care for her own family, and I never noticed the payments had stopped, because I was burying my wife, and then I was trying to figure out how to raise a 6-year-old who'd stopped speaking, and I lost track of a promise I made to people I'd wronged. I lost track of you. The silence that followed was heavier than the one at the dinner table, because this one wasn't built on anger. This one was built on the terrible, complicated understanding that grief does not make people better or worse. It simply makes them human, fallible, capable of good intentions, collapsing under the weight of their own unbearable losses. Grace sat down slowly in the chair, across from his desk, the folder trembling slightly in her hands as she opened it and saw 18 months of unpaid transfers. David's name typed neatly at the top of every page, a debt Michael hadn't even known he was failing to pay. "I don't know whether to hate you or thank you," she whispered. "You're allowed to feel both," Michael said. "I think I'd trust you less if you only felt one." "Why didn't you just call?" Grace asked. "Once you realized, why sit on this folder for 18 months instead of picking up a phone?" Michael was quiet for a moment, turning the small brass key over in his fingers like it might give him a better answer than the one he had. Because calling meant admitting I'd failed at the one thing I actually tried to do right after the accident. Everything else, the press statement, the insurance settlement, the safety audit, my lawyers handled. This was the one thing I did myself, with my own hands, and I still managed to lose track of it. It felt easier to leave it in a drawer than to look you in the eye and explain that. "That's not easier," Grace said. "That's just quieter. There's a difference." "I'm learning that," Michael admitted, slowly. She almost laughed, a short, humorless sound that surprised her more than it surprised him. David used to say something like that quiet and easy aren't the same thing. He said it about our marriage, actually. The first year, when we were both too tired and too broke to talk about anything real, and it was easier to just go to sleep angry than to have the hard conversation. He was the one who always pushed past the quiet. I used to resent him for it a little. Now I think it's the only reason we made it as far as we did. "He sounds like he was a better man than me," Michael said. "He was a better man than most men," Grace said simply. No bitterness in it now, just fact. "That's not really a fair comparison to hold you to." Michael almost smiled at that, the closest thing to real humor either of them had managed since the dinner table went silent. "You have every right to walk out of here and never let Ethan near your daughter again. I want you to know that I understand that, and I won't try to stop you, and I won't send my lawyers after you for anything you say tonight. I just needed you to see the whole truth before you decided. My mother says I've always been better at spreadsheets than people. I think she's right, and I think it cost me more than I let myself admit while my wife was alive to forgive me for it. I'm not deciding anything tonight," Grace said. "I'm too tired to decide anything tonight. But I'll tell you this much. My daughter hasn't stopped smiling since we walked through your door, and I haven't heard her laugh like that in longer than I want to admit. Whatever this is, it isn't nothing. I just don't know yet what it's supposed to become." They talked for almost an hour after that. Not about money, not anymore, but about David, about the man Grace had loved for 9 years, about the nights he used to sing off-key in their tiny kitchen with the window unit rattling in the background, and the way he'd never once complained about double shifts because he said complaining was a waste of good energy he could spend loving his family instead. Michael listened in a way Grace hadn't experienced from anyone in 18 months. Not the careful, pitying listening of people who don't know what to say, but real listening, the kind that made space for silence instead of rushing to fill it. And somewhere in that hour, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, the conversation stopped being about blame and started being about two people who had both lost the center of their world and had spent every day since pretending they were fine. Take a breath here, because we're heading into the hardest part of this story now, and if you've made it this far, you already know these two people are more connected than either of them realized. Comment below with one word for how you're feeling right now. And like this video if you believe some debts can never really be repaid, only honored. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Grace finally rose to collect Lily. And she found the two children asleep on the living room couch, Lily's head resting on Ethan's shoulder, the movie long since ended and forgotten, the television casting a soft blue light across both their faces. Ethan's hand was curled loosely around a folded piece of paper, and when Grace gently worked it free to carry him to the car, she saw what was written on it in a 6-year-old's careful, uneven handwriting. Dad laughed 3 times tonight. Mission complete. She had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Michael appeared in the doorway behind her, watching his sleeping son with an expression she hadn't seen on him all evening. Something unguarded, something that looked almost like the first honest breath a person takes after holding it too long. "I'd like to see you again," he said quietly. "Both of you. Not because of the trust, not because of any of that, because Ethan hasn't looked like this in 2 years, and neither, if I'm honest, have I." Grace looked down at the note in her hand, then at her daughter curled against a stranger's son, as if they'd known each other their whole lives, and she thought about the 18 months of silence, the unsigned settlement papers still sitting in her kitchen drawer, the anger she had carried like a second job. For so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down even for an evening. "One condition," she said. "Anything. No more secrets. If we do this, whatever this is, I need to know that what I see is what's actually there. I've spent 18 months finding out how much gets hidden behind polite dinners and quiet paperwork. I can't do that again." "No more secrets," Michael agreed. And something in the way he said it, steady, certain, the voice of a man finally choosing to stop hiding from his own grief, made Grace believe him. Not because she trusted rich men, not because she trusted anyone easily anymore, but because she had watched his son build an entire plan out of $40, and hope like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere it's been modeled, even in the smallest, most broken ways. She carried Lily to the car that night, with Ethan's note still folded in her coat pocket, and as she drove down the long, gated driveway and back toward the small apartment off Calle Ocho that suddenly felt a little less lonely than it had that morning, she found herself thinking about something her grandmother used to say, that some debts aren't paid in money, and some rescues don't look anything like the ones you imagine, and sometimes the people who save you are the very last people you expect to need saving from. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning that smelled like rain coming in off the Gulf Stream, Michael Kang stood in that same little park off Bayshore Drive, at that same swing set, holding his son's hand while Lily hung upside down from the monkey bars, and Grace laughed at something none of them would quite remember by evening, but would all remember feeling. The trust fund had been fully repaid. Backdated with interest, Michael insisted on adding himself, and a new policy now bore David Whitfield's name, not as a warning label buried in corporate paperwork, but as the foundation of every safety protocol Kang Dynamics would use going forward. Printed on a small plaque near the entrance of every distribution center the company owned from Hialeah to Fort Lauderdale. Ethan had started drawing again. His teacher mentioned it to Michael, without knowing why it mattered so much. Said his pictures had gotten brighter. Somehow, more people in them, more color. Michael kept every one of them in the same drawer where the trust folder used to live, because that drawer, he'd decided, was for things worth protecting. There was one drawing in particular Michael never showed anyone, not even Grace, though he suspected she would have understood it better than most. It showed 4 stick figures standing in front of a house that wasn't the estate off Old Cutler Road at all, but something smaller, simpler, with a crooked roofline and a lopsided sun in the corner of the sky. Underneath it, in the same careful, uneven handwriting from the note Grace had found folded in his sleeping hand, Ethan had written a single sentence that Michael read so many times the paper had started to soften at the folds. "This is what fixed looks like." He never asked his son what the drawing meant. Some things, he'd learned, you don't interrogate. You just carry them carefully, the way you'd carry something that might break if you held it too tightly, and you let them be exactly as true as they need to be. Grace kept the folded note in her coat pocket long after that first Saturday, moving it from jacket to jacket as the seasons barely changed the way they do in South Florida. And some mornings, folding laundry or scrubbing tables at the diner between the breakfast and lunch rush, she would think about how strange it was that grief and rescue had turned out to wear the same face all along, that the debt she'd spent 18 months resenting had somehow, without either of them planning it, become the bridge instead of the wound. And Grace still worked her shifts at the diner because she'd told Michael plainly that she wasn't interested in being rescued, only in being seen. And there is a difference between the two that not many people understand until someone finally shows them. But most Saturdays now, she brought Lily to that same park. And most Saturdays, a boy in a grey linen shirt was already waiting by the swings, no longer standing 11 minutes at the edge of anything, because he had finally learned that some things you don't have to rent. Sometimes they just have to be asked for. Before we go, if this story stayed with you, if somewhere in the middle you felt that ache of understanding, that love and belonging were never about the money at all, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that presence matters more than price, and leave a comment telling us the biggest lesson you're walking away with tonight. Because somewhere out there, right now, there is a lonely father who has forgotten how to laugh, and a lonely child trying to fix him with whatever small, brave thing they have. And maybe, if we're paying attention, so are we.